Detective James Morgan stood at the iron gates of Blackwood Manor, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The ancient house loomed before him, its windows like dark eyes watching his every move. A murder had been reported here last night, and as the town's best detective, he was called to solve it. "Welcome, detective," said Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, opening the heavy wooden door. Her hands shook slightly as she led him inside. "It's terrible what happened to Mr. Blackwood. Simply terrible." Richard Blackwood, the wealthy owner of the manor, had been found dead in his study at midnight. The circumstances were strange. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. Yet someone had managed to kill him. "Tell me everything you know," Morgan said, taking out his notebook. Mrs. Wilson twisted her apron nervously. Mr. Blackwood was working late in his study, as usual. He always locked himself in there after dinner. At exactly midnight, we heard a terrible scream. When we rushed to the study, the door was locked. We had to break it down, and that's when we found him, dead at his desk. Morgan walked to the study, examining everything carefully. The heavy oak door had splintered where it was forced open. Inside, nothing seemed disturbed except for the victim's desk. Papers were scattered everywhere, and a broken teacup lay on the floor, its contents staining the expensive carpet. There were 4 other people in the house that night: Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, John Parker, the gardener, Miss Sarah Blackwood, the victim's niece, and Dr. Thomas Green, a frequent guest of the house. Morgan interviewed each of them separately. Mrs. Wilson had been in the kitchen, preparing for the next day. "I served Mr. Blackwood his evening tea at 9 p.m. as always. He was alive and well then." John Parker claimed he was tending to the greenhouse. "The rare orchids need constant care, even at night. I was there until I heard the scream." Sarah Blackwood, a young woman with red-rimmed eyes, said she was reading in the library. "Uncle Richard and I had an argument earlier about my inheritance. He threatened to change his will, but I would never hurt him." Dr. Green stated he was writing letters in his guest room. "Richard was my oldest friend. I was staying here to discuss a business venture." Morgan returned to the study, his mind working through the details. The medical examiner had determined that poison was the cause of death, a rare type that acted quickly and was virtually tasteless. Something caught his eye. Under the desk, barely visible, was a small green leaf. Morgan picked it up carefully, studying its unusual shape. He'd seen this type of leaf before, in the greenhouse. He spent the next hour examining the greenhouse. Among the beautiful flowers were several deadly plants. One particular species caught his attention. Its leaves matched the one from the study perfectly. According to the reference book nearby, it was highly poisonous. Morgan noticed something else: fresh dirt on the garden path, leading from the greenhouse to a side door of the manor. The footprints were clear in the soft earth. He gathered everyone in the study. "I know who killed Mr. Blackwood," he announced. The murder was carefully planned, but small details revealed the truth. He turned to John Parker. "You claimed to be in the greenhouse all evening, tending to the orchids. That's partly true. You were in the greenhouse, but not for the orchids. You were preparing the poison." Parker's face went pale, but he remained silent. "You knew Mr. Blackwood's routine, his nightly tea, his habit of locking himself in the study. You also knew about the argument between him and Miss Blackwood. You thought she would be blamed for the murder." Morgan held up the leaf in an evidence bag. "This leaf comes from a rare, poisonous plant in your greenhouse. You used it to make the poison, then tried to destroy all evidence. But you missed this one leaf." He pointed to Parker's shoes. The dirt on your shoes matches the fresh footprints I found between the greenhouse and the manor's side door. You snuck in, added the poison to Mr. Blackwood's teacup before Mrs. Wilson served it, then returned to the greenhouse to establish your alibi. Parker's shoulders slumped. He was going to close down the greenhouse, he confessed. Said it was too expensive to maintain. This greenhouse has been my life's work. I couldn't let him destroy it. As the police led Parker away, Morgan watched the sun rise over Blackwood Manor. Another case solved, though the truth, as always, brought its own sadness. The shadow that had fallen over the manor would eventually lift, but its memory would linger in these halls forever. Miss Blackwood approached him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Detective. You've cleared my name and brought justice for my uncle." Morgan nodded solemnly. The case was closed, but he knew that behind every locked door, more mysteries waited to be solved. Such was the life of a detective, moving from one shadow to the next, bringing light to the darkness of human nature.